Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Fresius. I'm a professor of theology at Olivet Nazarene University, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today talking about this series on the foundations of our faith. This is part of a larger project whereby we're trying to establish what are the foundations of our faith under the assumption that if we're going to pass on our faith to our children, we ought to have a good idea of what that faith actually teaches. So in order to accomplish that, we're going to be looking at the Apostles' Creed and using that as the framework for establishing what the foundations of our faith really is. So to do that, we're going to look at this ancient Christian document, which functioned as a summary of the beliefs that were historically developed and held to by some of the earliest Christians. So we're going to be looking at it at a clause-by-clause approach, looking at how each clause gives us a different and a building picture of what the Christian faith is all about. So today, we're going to begin with the opening clause of the Creed, which is that I believe in God the Father Almighty. So to begin with, we want to explore what exactly is meant when Christianity talks about God as Father, and what isn't meant. And then to do the same thing with what do we mean when we say that God is almighty? And then what don't we mean? So to begin, we'd want to acknowledge that this analogy of God as Father can be taken differently depending upon our kind of relationship with our earthly father. That this identification of God as Father doesn't always kind of strike people well. That some of us, maybe we've had a great experience with our earthly fathers, and this is a helpful analogy. Others haven't had such a great experience, and this could be an analogy that's a little bit more difficult for them. And then still others might not even know their earthly father. And this can then create kind of a set of feelings that the analogy of God as Father is not meant to create. So at the outset, we do want to acknowledge that right, people have had those different experiences, and that fuels kind of how they think about God. Yet, at the same time, the analogy of God as Father is the most prevalent biblical image, as well as the most prevalent historical image of what God is like. So, to explore it, we want to just talk for a few minutes about what the earliest Christians would have thought about when they considered the identity of a father. So we all come into things with our own stereotypical approaches. Right? There are certain aspects within kind of a Western culture that are associated with fathers, certain characteristics. We see those oftentimes depicted in our sitcoms, in our commercials, and in other places, and that kind of fuels kind of our stereotypical approach to what a father ought to be like. And so what we want to do is kind of capture what were their stereotypical approaches to what fathers are like in the first century Roman Empire within Judaism of the day. So what were those stereotypes like? So for them, the idea was that the father is the head of the household. They even had a Latin phrase for it, the pater familias, which just, again, means that this is the person who runs everything when it comes to the household. They provide protection, stability, strength, and they also bring in the provisions that the family needs. In this, it's perhaps at least somewhat similar to the way that contemporary society pictures a father. They go to work, they bring home the paycheck, that sort of a thing. However, there's also a sense in the ancient culture that a father is one who invites you into the family. That fathers were kind of the gatekeepers, if you will, of who was a part of their family and who was not. So in this, a father kind of declares that you belong. They give you an invitation and an identity that you are a part of this family, and that the father is the one who creates that sense of belonging and that sense of identity. But even further than that, they would also identify a father as a loving caregiver. Here, this is perhaps a little bit different than the stereotypical approach within the United States, at least. Right? So when we think about when a child gets hurt, our stereotypes is the mom comes up, hugs the child, kisses the child's wound. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. The dad rubs some dirt in it. It doesn't hurt that much. Right? It becomes kind of the stereotypical approach. And the ancient culture would probably have pushed back against that just a little bit and say that no, a father is really, in fact, a loving caregiver. Jesus picks up on this idea in his fairly famous parable of the prodigal son. Many of you will be familiar with that parable, but just in short, you've got two sons, the older and the younger brother, and then you have the dad. The younger brother comes to the father and says, "Hey, Dad, give me my part of the inheritance. I want to go spend it now." Now, in their culture, what he's just said to Dad certainly amounts to, "Dad, I wish you were dead so that I could have your stuff." But it even pushes a little bit further than that. Most of these people would have been more agrarian. They would have been farmers. They would have owned property, that sort of thing. They wouldn't have had a lot of cash laying around. So for the father to essentially pay out for the son, he would have to sell a chunk of his land in order to provide that cash. And that would then take away from his ability to generate income during his retirement. So the son isn't just saying, "Hey, Dad, you're dead to me," but also, "I'm going to try to contribute to your downfall." So then the son goes off and he spends everything, wastes it all, ends up, feeding pigs, and discovers, right, maybe life at home wasn't so bad. What if I went home and volunteered to be a slave? Well, when the dad sees him coming, he does a few things. He runs, and then he gives his son a bunch of stuff: a ring, a cloak or robe, and shoes or sandals. And in their context, there's a lot of kind of depth to what the father has just done, which again illustrates the sense of a father as a loving caregiver. So the fact that he runs speaks a great deal. In ancient Jewish society, dads don't run. I tell that to my kids too, like, your dad doesn't run either. But dads didn't run because in part, they would wear a cloak. And so they have to lift that cloak up and expose their legs for everybody to see. And that was seen as highly shameful. And they live in what's called an honor-shame society. In that kind of a society, the worst thing possible is to shame your family. You want to try to avoid that at all costs. Best thing, to bring honor to them. In the son's actions, he has brought or heaped even shame on his family. And as the father runs, part of what Jesus is telling us is that he is taking that shame that the son has produced and he's taking it on himself, transferring that shame, welcoming the son then back into the family. So when he gives him the ring, that's a symbol of family. When he gives him the shoes, that's the symbol that you're not a servant, you're a full member of this family. So Jesus is very much highlighting for us that one of these characteristic traits of the father is that the father is one who loves and who gives for his family. So we get this kind of deep kind of sense of this characterization of fathers in this ancient culture. It would also be good for us to note what this analogy is not meant to say. So oftentimes if we say father, because, hey, we're people, all right, we think of a male, all right, a guy. The idea of God as father is not meant to imply that God is a man. In the ancient thought, God's a spirit. Spirits don't have body parts because they don't have bodies. So God would not be seen as having a gender. That's more of our kind of association. We'd also want to note that this isn't the only description of God that we find throughout the Bible. In fact, we find a number of identifiers that we would typically associate with mothers. So God is routinely depicted as wanting to hold an infant close to his chest, just as a mother would. Jesus will talk about when he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, that he longs to gather them together as a hen would gather her chicks. Picturing himself as one who is sacrificing his life in order to protect his children. So they had this deep sense of a self-sacrificial love that they associated with God, which was typically something associated with mothers in their culture. A final note on this idea of fatherhood, then, part of the idea of the analogy is that God is establishing what it is to be a father. So the purpose of the analogy is then for human fathers to say, how does God depict what it is to be a father, and how can I emulate that? Far too often we probably mix that one up, and we talk about that whatever our earthly father is like, that must be what God is like. And so again, the point of the analogy is to go that opposite direction, that earthly fathers ought to be like God. Well, the clause then ends with this characterization then of God as almighty. And we want to just talk for a minute or two about what is meant by that. So typically, a couple of qualities or characteristics come to the front. These are the somewhat famous omnis, that God is omnipotent, God is all-powerful, by which Christianity just means that God is capable of doing anything that is consistent with God's will. So that God's will not be thwarted, that God ultimately is the victor, those sorts of things. The second one is that God is omniscient, that God knows everything that it's possible to know. Here, there are usually some limitations that are placed on this idea, that God cannot know logical impossibilities, so God can't know a square circle, something like that. But it also would include the sense that God knows the future. So in classical Christian thought, God exists outside of time. So what we experience is the passage of time. There's a past, a present, and a future is just now for God, that everything is this eternal now or this eternal present. So from our perspective, then God knows the future, God knows what we'll do, but for God it's just all right now. So that God is omniscient. The third one then is that God is omnipresent, that God is present everywhere. Here we'll usually talk about this as a general presence, that God is generally here. God can hear us, God can see us wherever we're at, so that his spirit is present everywhere. And then we would talk about that there is a more localized sense of that there are certain places where God manifests God's presence in particular or unique ways. In the Old Testament, when this happened, they would usually build some kind of a marker point, set up some stones to remember that here, God spoke to me. This is part of what the temple was doing. So they didn't think like the temple was like they had God contained and that's God's house, but that this is a special place here in this world where God uniquely manifests God's presence. So God present in both a general way and then also specific localized ways. The final aspect then of Almighty is that God is perfect. Here, English sometimes does a bit of a disservice. We use perfect for a lot of things. You want to have soup tonight for dinner? Perfect, right? Perfect is something that you can get to. Try a little bit harder on your math test, go and try it again, and maybe you'll get a perfect score. So that it's something that we can attain to. In classical Christian thought, that would not apply to God. Classical Christian thought is what I call static perfection. That God has nothing that gets added to God and nothing that can be taken away from God. That by God's nature, God is perfect and God is complete. So there's our first clause then, that God is the Father and God is Almighty. Next time we want to talk about the second aspect that deals with God the Father, which is that God is the creator of heaven and earth.